This is Optimal Finance Daily, episode 1205, Safe Withdrawal Rate for Early Retirees, Part 1, by the Mad Fientist of madfientist.com. And I'm Dan, I am your host, and this is where I read to you from some of the best blogs on personal finance. I'm here every single day doing that, including weekends and holidays. And this isn't the only show in our podcast network. We've actually got 5 shows where we've got this same format going, but covering different topics. So if you'd like, search for Optimal Living Daily wherever you're hearing this show to find all 5 of our podcasts. But for now, let's get right to it as we continue optimizing your life. Safe Withdrawal Rate for Early Retirees, Part 1, by the Mad Fientist of madfientist.com. As the Mad Fientist, I take it upon myself to analyze common financial advice to determine how it applies to those of us retiring very early in life. Since our financial lives are drastically different from the normal work until 65 employee, most mainstream thinking isn't relevant, so I'm left to investigate the data myself and form my own conclusions. For example, when I showed that a traditional IRA is better than a Roth IRA for early retirees, and that a health savings account should actually be used as an additional retirement account. Today I'm going to tackle the Safe Withdrawal Rate, SWR, and it's my hope that this post becomes the definitive guide to the SWR for early retirees. Most of the conclusions in this article are based on the great research that Michael Kitzes, one of the internet's most respected retirement planners, has done on this topic. I've cited the source material, so I highly encourage you to read through the articles that I link to because they're packed with additional information that's going to help you feel even more confident about the conclusions of this post. What is the safe withdrawal rate? Before we dive into the really good stuff, a bit of background. The safe withdrawal rate is simply the rate that you can withdraw from your portfolio every year that ensures you have a high probability of never running out of money. The SWR of 4% per year, inflation adjusted, is the rate that Trinity study researchers recommended for 30-year retirements, and it's the rate you most often see quoted. Why it's safe? Very safe. Many people like to challenge the safe withdrawal rate and warn that this time is different, and if you start withdrawing 4% from your portfolio every year, you'll be forced to eat cat food before you know it. Fear sells much better than math and reason, so ignore the fear-mongering and instead continue listening. Disclaimer. It must be said that although this article will show that the SWR is safe, past performance cannot guarantee future outcomes. So if you're looking for certainty, you won't find it here. Nothing in life is certain though, except for death and, well, that's it. Some people say there's also certainty in taxes, but since you're a Mad Fientist reader, you know that's not the case. End disclaimer. Kitzes highlights some impressive stats to show how safe the SWR actually is. Quote, the safe withdrawal rate actually has a 96% probability of leaving more than 100% of the original starting principal. End quote. Quote, in fact, even when starting with a 4% initial withdrawal rate, less than 10% of the time does the retiree ever finish with less than the starting principal, and it has only happened 4 times in the modern era of markets. For retirees who started a 30-year retirement time horizon in 1929, 1937, 1965, and 1966. End quote. Quote, over 2/3 of the time, the retiree finishes the 30-year time horizon still having more than double their starting principal. The median wealth at the end, on top of the 4% rule with inflation-adjusted spending, is almost 2.8 times the starting principal. In other words, it's overwhelmingly more likely that retirees will have opportunities to ratchet their spending higher than a 4% rule than ever need to spend that conservatively in the first place. End quote. But this time is different. That's great the safe withdrawal rate worked so well in the past, but surely now with the Great Recession, recent flash crashes, etc., this time is different? It's not. I know it seems like the financial world has been crazy over the last decade, but recent retirees actually aren't looking too bad. In his post, How Has the 4% Rule Held Up Since the Tech Bubble and the 2008 Financial Crisis?, Kitzes explains that, quote, the 2008 retiree, even having started with the global financial crisis out of the gate, is already doing far better than any of the worst historical scenarios. In other words, while the tech crash and especially the global financial crisis were scary, they still haven't been the kind of scenarios that spell outright doom for the 4% rule. End quote. So what would the future have to look like for the 4% rule to fail for recent retirees? Quote, it would only be appropriate to assume a safe withdrawal rate lower than the historical 4% to 4.5% rate if you believe that equities will fail to deliver even a 1% real return over the next 15 years, implying given current dividend and inflation levels, that the S&P 500 price level will be lower in 2027 than it was in 2007, which would also be lower than it was in 2000, resulting in no appreciation for 27 years. End quote. Do you think the stock market will remain flat for 27 years? Are companies no longer innovating enough to eke out some growth in nearly 3 decades? Unlikely. So why aren't these scary crashes and recessions spelling the end of the safe withdrawal rate? To answer that, we have to investigate how a portfolio actually gets depleted too quickly. Sequence of return risk. When you consider that the average real market return is 7%, you would think that withdrawing 4% every year would never deplete a portfolio because the growth would more than cover your inflation-adjusted spending. 7% minus 4% equals 3% portfolio growth every year. It's actually not the average that matters, though. Rather, it's when the ups and downs happen that determine how likely your portfolio will survive longer. Kitces gives the following easy-to-understand example. Quote, imagine a retiree with $1 million who needs to take a big $500,000 withdrawal at the end of the first year. With the good sequence, the portfolio grows 100% from $1 million to $2 million, easily funds the $500,000 withdrawal, and after the 50% drop in year 2, finishes with $750,000. By contrast, with the bad sequence, the portfolio falls 50% to $500,000, the $500,000 withdrawal completely depletes the portfolio down to zero, and the subsequent 100% return is now irrelevant because you can't compound an account balance of zero. End quote. As you can see, it's the sequence of returns that matter. As he states, quote, once cash outflows are occurring, it's not enough for returns to average out in the long run if the portfolio could be completely depleted before the good returns finally show up. End quote. So, you need to survive the first part of retirement so that the inevitable gains that occur are meaningful enough to your portfolio to offset the down years. First decade matters most. In Kitces' research, he analyzed the historical data to see what metrics actually matter when it comes to the SWR and portfolio longevity. Here's what he found. 1-year return. Quote, overall, the correlation between the safe withdrawal rate and the first year's return is a mere 0.21. End quote. A correlation of 0.21 is so low, if the markets crash right after you retire, don't freak out. There's very low correlation between your first year's return and the success of the SWR. 10-year nominal return. Quote, the correlation between the safe withdrawal rate and the 10-year return is 0.44. End quote. The 10-year returns correlation is also low, but that's because the nominal return doesn't factor in inflation. If the market returns 7%, but everything you buy gets 10% more expensive, it's easy to see how the nominal return on its own can't be a good predictor of portfolio longevity. 30-year real return. Quote, on a 30-year real return basis, there is a solid 0.43 correlation to the safe withdrawal rate, which actually means 30-year real returns are just as predictive as 10-year nominal. End quote. This one really surprised me. You'd think that after factoring in inflation and looking at the 30-year returns, you'd be able to easily predict if a withdrawal rate would have been successful, but it's not, because the 30-year returns don't have enough information about the sequence of returns. 10-year real return. Quote, when the time horizon is consolidated to view just the first 10 years and is evaluated on a real return basis, the correlation spikes to a whopping 0.79 with a clear predictive trend. End quote. Bingo. As Kitces describes, quote, it turns out 10 years is really the sweet spot for sequence of returns risk. A bad decade at the start of retirement is more predictive than 1-year returns and is also more predictive than 30-year returns. End quote. Therefore, if your first decade of retirement goes smoothly, you'll likely end up with a lot of money left over when you die, or you can increase your spending during retirement. If your first decade isn't great and you deplete a big chunk of your portfolio early on, you may be in trouble. To be continued. You just listened to part 1 of the post titled Safe Withdrawal Rate for Early Retirees by the Mad Fientist of madfientist.com. And I'm going to finish the rest of this post for you tomorrow. That's going to do it for today. Hope you have a great rest of your day and are having a great weekend if you're listening in real time. And I'll see you back here tomorrow for the Sunday show, where your optimal life awaits.